We've invited Mr Hockey back to the program and he joins me now in Sydney. Joe Hockey, the head of Treasury, as you know, today gave a very detailed explanation as to the basis for the various budget numbers. Do you still describe those Treasury assumptions as casino economics as you did on this program on budget night?
Well, Kerry, it's interesting because Ken Henry agrees with what we stated, and that is that there is no recent period where there has been 6 consecutive years of growth of more than 4% per annum, which is the underlying assumption for Kevin Rudd's plan to have, in his words, $300 billion of debt. The debt will be far greater, Kerry, far greater, if on one of those years it doesn't reach the assumption that Ken Henry suggested.
Well, in fairness to Ken Henry, what he said in that same breath virtually was that what he saw as virtually an exact parallel between 1993 and 1999, where growth averaged above 4% for those 6 years, and in fact 4.3% average over 7 years. And they based their estimates in this budget on 5 important economic variables. Do you still argue that that's casino economics?
Well, Kerry, you're arguing an average versus what they are specifically basing as their assumptions.
But there was only one year out of those 7 years where it was below 4%.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You see, Kevin Rudd has said that he will get the budget out of deficit into surplus within that period. And the underlying assumption is that he will have growth of more than 4% in each of those years. That's like saying Don Bradman will score a century in every one of his next 6 innings. Well, Don Bradman never did that, but his average was 100. So the point is...
Do you then acknowledge that even if the growth dipped below 4% in one of those years, but was above the Treasury estimates for another, and that the average still averaged out at what they're saying it will, that the outcome will still be the same?
Well, look, as Glenn Stevens said today, Kerry, we don't know. But what we ask the government to do, now that it has become the biggest spending government in modern Australian history, now it is taking us to record levels of deficit and debt, now that Australian families, every person in Australia now has a debt of $9,000 to the Australian government, now that we are at this point, we want Mr Rudd to be fair dinkum with the Australian people about how long it will take to pay off the deficit, let alone the debt. The debt is going to be with us for many, many years. But the question is, how deep are the deficits going to be? And the assumptions in the budget suggest that they're optimistic, hugely optimistic.
Do you acknowledge that you're not just arguing with Kevin Rudd, you are arguing with all of the economic muscle that the Treasury officials themselves can bring to bear?
Treasury's not beyond, getting it wrong.
But doesn't the government have to rely substantially on what Treasury is telling us?
Of course you do.
Just as your government did.
Well, of course you do. And this is one of the reasons why we suggested that there be a parliamentary budget office which would provide that additional layer of scrutiny. But Treasury's got it wrong. Kerry, I'll give you an example. On the cigarette tax. Treasury has underestimated the total revenue from cigarette tax by more than $1 billion since 2001. And yet somehow the government expects everyone to believe that the Treasury is going to accurately forecast what the revenue is from cigarette tax over the next 10 years. So, if I can take a leaf out of John Kenneth Galbraith's book and suggest that he actually said, it was a very good point, he said that economic forecasters make astrologers look good.
But you also have to acknowledge that is the best advice that the government has to go with.
Terrific. But
so if the government is basing its policies on that economic advice in the same way that your government did, then what are you criticising?
Well, my criticism is with Mr Rudd. Mr Rudd put his hand on his heart and said to the Australian people, we will have the nation out of deficit within 6 years. Now, that was all based on extraordinary assumptions into the forward estimates. That's our argument.
Well, you're saying they're extraordinary assumptions. Ken Henry is saying they're conservative assumptions.
And the fact that Ken Henry came out so aggressively defending his assumptions today illustrates the fact that there was a consensus view amongst all of the economists, a consensus view that the Treasury assumptions were optimistic. Now, look, I hope, like every Australian does, I hope that Ken Henry's right. We really want Australia to come out of this. We want it to come out faster and in better shape than other countries. But let's be fair dinkum.
Ken Henry also made plain that it was Treasury that believed the government stimulus packages would save some 200,000, not create, but save some 200,000 jobs through the next year. Through to next year. On budget night, you said that Treasury's jobs calculation had been, quote, plucked out of the air. Do you still say that Ken Henry and his senior Treasury officials plucked that figure out of the air?
Well, ultimately the figures are the government's. And you know, the assumptions are, Kerry, ultimately they're saying that the economy is going to grow faster than any comparable recovery. You see, the interesting thing is, for so long the government has been saying that this is a downturn that Australia hasn't seen in 70 years. Yet they are making an assumption about the Australian recovery that takes into account every recovery in the last 70 years.
And says,
so either it's different,
and says that their calculation this time is more conservative than what happened after 1990 or what happened after the 80s recession.
We're going into this downturn in better shape because of what we did in government for 11 years. We are going in better shape, and the downturn is not going to be as deep as 1990, 1991.
But you see, you quote the Reserve Bank as saying that. That is, again, that's a Reserve Bank forecast. And they say that their forecast is based partly on the interest rate cuts that they've implemented,
which are very important,
and partly on the government stimulus packages, which you denigrate.
Well,
so it kind of goes round and round in circles.
It does in part. That's economics. It goes around in circles. The bottom line is, what about jobs? What about growing the pie rather than reallocating pieces? And what about the poorly targeted spending of the government? Because of the $188 billion of Kevin Rudd net debt, $124 billion is new expenditure. Kevin Rudd has been spending about $10 million an hour since he was elected, which is a huge amount of money, and it's all now borrowed money.
You said that unemployment, that the figure of 200,000 jobs saved by the stimulus packages was the government's figure. Of course, the government has to take responsibility for the figure, but the figure was calculated, Ken Henry says, very carefully by himself and other Treasury officials.
Well, the last time...
Was it plucked out of the air by Ken Henry or not, as you've claimed?
Well, Kerry, last time we heard about a Treasury forecast on jobs, there was an assumption that 100% of the fiscal stimulus would be spent. Now, clearly that hasn't happened. Again, the consensus view is perhaps 20% of that cash splash has been spent. Therefore, it hasn't had the economic multiplier effect that Treasury assumed.
Well, this is what the Reserve, you know, the document that you've responded to very strongly earlier tonight, that was reported on the 7 network. This is the Reserve Bank document that they retained on FOI. This is one quote from that document. This is the Reserve Bank again. Quote, "The federal government's recent economic stimulus package is expected to boost consumption growth significantly in the March and June quarters." So here's the Reserve Bank. You see, you quote the Reserve Bank when it suits you to back your own case. Do you support...
Well, we sound like the government then, don't we?
Well, no, I'm putting this to you. And my question is, so do you therefore support the Reserve Bank view expressed in this document that the government's recent economic stimulus package will boost consumption, or is expected to boost consumption growth significantly in the March? Significantly.
Yeah, expected. These are all the... Kerry, this is like, this is like looking into a crystal ball, you know, and what we do... Well, what we do is deal with reality. And the reality is every Australian now has $9,000 of debt thanks to Kevin Rudd. That's the bottom line. He said...
Well, then you acknowledge here and now that you also base a lot of your opinions and statements on speculation. As everybody else does.
Well, we take the best available information we can get.
So does the Reserve Bank,
and what we do,
Treasury.
Well, that's right. And what we do is we form our policies on that basis. And what we have said, as Malcolm Turnbull said, what we have said is that the government should be focused on growing the pie, stimulating small business, which will be the engine room of the recovery, not simply focusing on handing out cash, $900 to every person that they come across, or spending $3 billion on pink bats. It's got to be targeted, Kerry. And you know what? They've got to be, what they say has got to have a lot more to it than a heroic assumption, which is the basis of the forecast.
And we're out of time, but Joe Hockey, thanks very much for talking with us.
Thank you.
It's been 4.5 years since Tasmania's then